Welcome to the Rhetorics.
Glad to be here.
This podcast was written by Uche Mefor,
Who is?
convener of the Igbo Biafra Nationalists and the indigenous people of Igbo Nation for self-determination.
Oh, wow.
We'll be talking about the economic realities of the Igbo people in Nigeria,
Okay.
specifically in the Southeast Igbo Biafra region.
Got it.
We're going to go beyond just surface-level stuff.
Deeper.
Yeah, and unpack the systemic issues that can create an uneven playing field.
For sure. I think that's an important thing to consider, how, the structures and economic policies can really impact specific groups
Exactly.
and create disadvantages.
So one of the things we want to talk about today is political representation.
Okay.
The Southeast Igbo Biafra region, according to our sources,
Right.
only has 5 states,
Okay.
but other regions have 6 or more. So how does that number of states impact their economic standing?
Well, if you think about Nigeria's federal revenue allocation, it's influenced a lot by the number of states a region has and how many local government areas.
Right.
So more states is going to mean more senators and representatives in the National Assembly.
Yeah.
And that has a huge impact on the region's political clout and how well they can secure resources.
So they're already starting in a hole, almost,
You could say.
when it comes to federal funding, whether we're talking about infrastructure or education or healthcare.
Yeah, it's not just about having a smaller voice.
Yeah.
It's about getting a smaller slice of the pie right from the start.
Right. And our sources also paint a pretty stark picture of the infrastructure gap in the Southeast Igbo Biafra region.
For sure.
Roads, schools, hospitals, they all seem to be behind other regions when it comes to development.
Right, and that underinvestment in infrastructure directly impacts economic growth.
Yeah.
I mean, if businesses have to deal with bad roads and unreliable power and there isn't access to quality education for their workers, how can they compete
Right.
on a national or international level?
And that makes you wonder if that underinvestment is actually strategic
Oh, interesting.
to keep the region economically dependent.
That's certainly a perspective to think about.
Yeah.
And when you add to that the attacks on Igbo-owned businesses, it really strengthens that feeling of marginalization.
Yeah. And there have been a lot of those. Arson, looting, especially in markets dominated by Igbo traders.
Right.
We saw a lot of that during the 2023 elections.
Yeah.
And what's really concerning is the lack of response from security forces.
Absolutely. Because the economic impact of all those attacks
Right.
is just massive. Imagine all the lost income, the disruption to supply chains, and just the psychological impact on these entrepreneurs.
Oh, yeah.
And when those attacks keep happening and no one's held accountable,
Right.
it makes you wonder how committed people are to protecting those businesses.
Yeah. So it's like a double whammy. You limit their access to resources through policies, but then you also create this environment where their businesses are super vulnerable.
And it's made even worse when you think about how the Igbo are excluded from positions of power.
Okay, now that's another thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Because we have the federal character principle.
Right, which in theory aims for equal representation
Right.
in government and the military. But when you look at what's actually happening,
Yeah.
it's a different story.
So it's there, but it's not really being implemented.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that exclusion means they have very little influence.
The Igbo people.
Yes, the Igbo people. They have very little influence over the decisions that affect them economically.
Right.
And they're often not represented enough in really important sectors.
Like what?
Oil and gas, finance, even key ministries in the government.
Right, yeah.
So that further limits their economic power.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
It is.
So this has been The Rhetorics, a podcast written by Uche Mefor.
It's been really insightful.
And I think the big takeaway for our listeners is that this kind of economic marginalization is rarely an accident.
Right.
It's the result of a system that is designed to benefit certain people.
At the expense of others.
Yeah. So the question is, what can we do to dismantle these systems and create a truly level playing field?
That's the question, isn't it?
For all Nigerians.
Absolutely.
Including those in the Southeast Igbo Biafra region.
Definitely.
So much to think
A
about.
lot to consider.
Thanks for joining me today.
It was a pleasure to be here.
And thank you to our listeners. We'll see you next time.
Until then.